You're listening to Frontier Matters, the podcast from 1914 Reader. Join us as we dive into bold conversations on growth and change in the frontier economies of the world.
Our guest today is a Jamaica-born sociologist and anthropologist, trained at the University of the West Indies and the University of Chicago, where he earned a PhD in anthropology. His fieldwork in Western Ghana and among migrant workers in Ghana and Burkina Faso gave him an unusually grounded understanding of West African society, labor, and economic change. He is Professor Emeritus at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and over the course of a long and distinguished career, has become one of the most original thinkers on the connection between Africa and the Caribbean. At a time when both African and Caribbean societies are still grappling with questions of state capacity, elite failure, and structural transformation, his voice is an especially valuable one. And on a personal note, I should say that I regard him as one of my intellectual mentors, and I've benefited immensely over the years from his intellectual generosity. Professor Donald Robotham, welcome to Frontier Matters.
Thanks very much, Faye and Toby. I was trying to figure out who you're speaking about, but maybe later on it will become clearer. Didn't sound like me, but there it is. Anyhow, it's a great honor. It truly is. I know it's a cliche, but I really mean it. Just the work that yourself and Toby put in, which is tremendous, and which in many ways, at least in the short term, may appear thankless. I believe, actually, it won't be thankless, and it will turn out to be actually quite pivotal in the political and economic development, not only of Nigeria, but of West Africa, and I hope, too, of us in the Caribbean. So it's a tremendous job that you're all doing, and I hope you may never get discouraged from doing it by all the many obstacles, which I know I can only imagine. Like this,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so let me start with a sort of a simple question, or maybe not simple, but so when you place Nigeria, Ghana, and Jamaica side by side, what are the deepest historical continuities that most people miss, and where do you think people tend to take the comparison a bit too far?
Okay, well, first of all, we have to be careful because, of course, the Caribbean is varied. Jamaica is not quite the same as Barbados, and it's not the same as Trinidad and so on. And of course, Bahamas, not to mention Bermuda, different kind of setup. So the variation in the Caribbean is important to understand. So we're talking a bit about Jamaica. The first thing I want to say is scale. I mean, we mustn't lose sight of the difference in scale. I mean, Jamaica we think we are big in the Caribbean, 155 miles by 60, 70 miles, 4,400. I mean, you could fit Jamaica into a corner of Lagos and nobody would notice it, right? Not to mention Barbados. Barbados is 26 miles long, okay? So the problem of the differences in scale, I think, is a huge difference. And it's perhaps not enough not recognized enough as important, especially on economic issues, because our markets are inherently constrained and tiny markets. So it means room for developing, let's say, large-scale manufacturing is almost non-existent in a way, but we can come back to that. So scale is one difference. I think also, and we're sort of touching on going back and forth, the effect of slavery, plantation slavery in Jamaica is something we have talked about. I think has made quite a big difference in Jamaica and Ghana and Nigeria. In this important respect, two important respects. One is the rural culture, which is the underpinning of the culture, I would say, in all three countries, is the rural culture sort of underpins everything, Jamaica is still about 50% rural, and it's sort of stuck at that level, partly because since it's so small, you don't really need to migrate to hold a job in
Yeah.
a different part of the country. So it's sort of stabilized like that. It's 2.9 million people, stretching it maybe a little less. The birth rate is very, very low in Jamaica, barely meeting replacement things. My joke, I usually like to laugh at, Jamaican men claim that they never use condoms. At the same time, there's a massive increase in condom sales. So who's buying these condoms is a big mystery. But setting that aside, birth rate is really low, which is different. So that the youth population in Jamaica and the Caribbean generally is declining. Right? So dependency is declining in that. In fact, the profile is much closer to what you see in a more developed country, where the population is aging, and therefore the health requirements on the public health system are different, moving up to chronic diseases and so on. So scale and all those things make a difference. And then because of slavery, I can't emphasize this too much, we don't have a, 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 a structural patriarchal culture in the countryside. We don't have it. We don't have any lineages. I think this is hard for people to wrap their head around from, say, Nigeria and Ghana. So you don't have lineages. So how does it work? We don't have any chiefs. Right? We don't have any. It's an interesting historical question, which we talked about before. We used to have, if you read the 18th century literature, if you read literature up to the early 19th century, you see the accounts mentioning in Jamaica the existence of different nations. In other words, tribal distinctions. I would say, by emancipation, by the 1830s, this has gone, completely gone. So there's absolutely no, among Black Jamaicans or any Jamaican, there's no difference between who is from this ethnicity or from that ethnicity and so on. You have really one Black ethnicity, which I think, of course, is very, very different. And this is one thing which puzzles Jamaicans going to Ghana and Nigeria. Oh, really? I didn't know that. I didn't know you had, I know you have chiefs, right? But I didn't know you had lineages and this whole structure of authority underpinning the rural culture. Now, that's quite a big difference, I think, in the three different countries, where Nigeria and Ghana is on one side and Jamaica is on the side. It's interesting. It affects land tenure. So we have, because of the African heritage, we also have what is called family land which cannot be bought and sold, right? Extremely contentious. Absolute. Similar to the kind of issues you may, but it's a tiny portion of land, right? It's certainly not the main. Land is held on sort of typical fee simple lines of, private property lines, so that the whole nature of the rural economy is different from what you'll find in Nigeria and Ghana. So those are some of the differences. I think also, this is an tricky one, and you may want to correct me. It's interesting how the question of color operates in Jamaica compared to Nigeria and Ghana, because being light-skinned matters in Jamaica a lot, right? It also, and increasingly in a funny kind of way, entering into the picture in Nigeria and to some degree in Ghana, bleaching and that kind of stuff. But in Jamaica, light-skinned is correlated with wealth, and it isn't in Nigeria, right? No. But it is in Jamaica, where the really wealthy business community is a light-skinned community, mulatto like me, for example, or partly Jewish Lebanese descent, a little, not Indian so much, because Indian population is tiny, So you have a wealthy black upper middle class in Jamaica, and increasingly moving into business, especially through real estate. In fact, that's one of the political tensions in the place. But you don't really have the big companies are not black companies. And this is a striking difference. I think, for example, when Nigerian businessmen come to Jamaica, like Tony, what's his name? Tony
Elumelu.
when he came to Jamaica, not maybe about 5 years ago, perhaps, I don't think he could have missed this point. But all his interlocutors, right? Many of them nowhere as wealthy as he is, by the way, but still wealthy people, were all light-skinned people. I don't think he could have missed it, right? So these are some of the differences, you know. I mean, Jamaica is, you know, an upper middle income country. Its per capita income is sort of, I don't know, straining to reach 9,000. Let's put it that way, you know. So those are some of the differences. So Jamaica faces different developmental dilemmas and challenges from the ones which are faced by Ghana and Nigeria, although, like any country in the global south, there's a certain general similarity to our situation. So those are some of the things, you know. I think one of the most striking ones too, this is you know, Jamaica historically, in terms of slave trade, the three big groups in Jamaica are from Ghana, southern Ghana mainly, but not only, northern Ghana as well. Nigeria, the east, coming through Calabar, coming through Bonny, and that side. And then Angola, Congo, Angola, those are three. There's hardly, I'm sorry to disappoint, there's hardly any Yoruba influence in Jamaica. I mean, there is a village called Abiakuta, but it's actually quite interesting. And Shoyinka, when they're famously disappointed and so on. It's in the west. It's in the area where the hurricane struck, by the way, right in the top. Yeah. So it would have been hit hard. It's interesting because it is not, the people are not people who originate during the main period of slavery. It's a village, people by groups rescued by the Royal Navy after the slave trade had been
abolished.
Abolished, right? And the Royal Navy patrolling seized the boats and so on. And the Abiakuta people come from, which makes sense because it's in that 19th century period that you see the Yoruba slave trade and Brazil and so on and so forth. So, but Jamaica doesn't have that. Jamaica is heavily Ghanaian, heavily Eastern Nigerian, and thirdly, Congo. So I would say Jamaica and Haiti are the two most African, culturally speaking, countries in the Caribbean. Quite striking. And it's not an accident, you know, that Rasta comes out of Jamaica, that Garveyism comes out of Jamaica, that reggae comes out of Jamaica. This is not an accident, right? Because it's a very African-based culture. There's a very strong Pan-African consciousness in Jamaica. I mean, at the general level, especially, I would say, especially in the middle class, very strong. So you have this very interesting situation where you have this sort of light-skinned elite and so on, right? And at the same time, you have this strong Pan-African culture, even on the political right. It's really interesting. It's across everybody, right? And it's, I think, part of the politics of the country is connected with those kinds of tensions, you know. So it's an interesting thing. Of course, Nollywood is extremely popular, you know. I mean, people know, you know, people say, oh, look at that man in the keke. I mean, a Jamaican will say something like that, right? Or the barber that we go to, this guy, He only dresses in Yoruba clothes, cap and everything. That's all he wears to work every single day, right? So there's a kind of popular Pan-African. It's not an intellectual project of the middle classes only. There's a sort of popular Pan-Africanism.
Ground up, yeah.
Yeah, which is it, but also, of course, combined with tremendous ignorance, sort of TV views of, you have TVs in Africa, you have a light bulb. You ever seen a light bulb before you come to Jamaica? It's all sorts of nonsense blended in with this tremendous Pan-African thrust, which is, I think, we're very proud of it in many ways. And also it means that people are welcome. We have significant communities of Nigerian professionals in Jamaica, people growing bitter leaf, making bitter leaf soup and doing their thing and so on. Quite a big community, mainly professionals, doctors and so on. Jamaica is very welcoming to African professionals, Nigerians, Ghanaians. There's no problem in being employed. There's no problem in advancing in your career. There's no feeling that you're taking away jobs. There's nothing like that at all. Right? You'll be welcome with open arms. And I wish that we had a closer connection, especially between our intellectual communities, so that we could all deepen the relationship on a substantive way in common research endeavors and so on. So, I could go on forever, but I won't.
Yeah, we're gonna come to a lot of this, but I mean, Toby will probably.
Yeah. Again, thank you for doing this, Prof. A question that is very relevant for Africa and Africans today is ethnicity, and some of elements of my questions are already foreshadowed in your answer, which is something you've also written quite a lot about. You said that Jamaica is full of references to Igbo, Ibibio, and other African nations.
Yeah.
Nigeria today, by my own recollection, counts about 250 ethnicities.
Yes.
But in Jamaica, by emancipation, those boundaries have largely dissolved. How
Yes.
did that actually happen? Was the decisive force the plantation's deliberate ethnic mixing, the scale of Jamaican slavery, Christianity, the absence of elders and lineages, which you already mentioned?
This is not. It's not adequate. I've done some work on it, but it's not adequate. So I give you an indication of some of the things. First of all, the slave trade to Jamaica is very big. It was like about 900. It's much bigger than the slave trade to the United States, for example. People don't realize that, but so about 900,000 people. Mortality was tremendous. So that at emancipation, even though 900,000 people came over, emancipation is about recording about emancipation of about 310,000 people being emancipated. So you realize that mortality was ferocious, right? The British, the plantations tended to be big in Jamaica. Average size of a plantation was bigger, substantially bigger, and also the labor force substantially larger than in the United States. Right? So that, and the further thing is Jamaica had a lot of absenteeism, especially Scottish landowners, Glasgow, people from the Glasgow area, right? The so-called classical aristocracy rooted in Jamaica. So that Jamaica has a lot of all these Scottish place names all over the place, Clanmurthy and Kilcuddy and all kinds of places. But the effect of that was that you had these large groups of people enslaved on a state and mixed in. For security reasons, the British did not concentrate, say, one ethnicity to predominate. No, this was dangerous stuff. It's very interesting. The whole idea was to mix the ethnicities so that you could break down any possibility of conspiracy. And this was wise because, in fact, a number of the biggest slave revolts always had this ethnic core in it, driven by a sort of, especially a Southern Ghanaian core in it, right? A Fanti, or people like to say Ashanti, but it's probably more Fanti, but anyhow. Um, so there's tremendous mixing on the estates across ethnicities. And because of the absenteeism, there was also a tendency. They would appoint an agent called an attorney to run the estate. And what that person would do, he'd be responsible, let's say, for several estates. He would amalgamate the labor force and move them across boundaries, so that there was considerable mixing in the population within a limited sphere, of course, and under the conditions of plantation slavery. Then the system of farming under slavery was a kind of feudal system. The estates were basically on the coast, but always ran up into the hills. Jamaica has a central mountainous spine. A typical estate started on the plains and then went up into the hills. The plains was where the sugar was grown. The hills were allocated in plots to people who were enslaved, and people would grow their own provisions on a Saturday and a Sunday and take them to market. This is why you have markets in Jamaica, which are exactly like or very similar to markets in Nigeria or Ghana, because during slavery, there was an internal marketing system. Now, as you know, even now, just like then, the market is a place where many romances occur.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, this didn't respect any ethnic boundary or any such thing. So over time, this kind of grinding down of these divisions in social interactions, family relationships, and then political revolts. And at the end, I think, the impact of conversion to Christianity, which I think is a factor at the end, towards the end. It comes quite relatively late. It comes maybe in the late 18th century, early years of the 19th century, long before Lugard can get interfere with you people and so forth. In the period when Uthman Danfodio is doing his thing, so to speak.
Okay.
In that same period, we have the missionaries in Jamaica, and the conversion to Christianity, of course, just like Islam in a way, helps to create this idea of a community which is not based on ethnicity, but based on Christian belief. So I think those kinds of factors eventually led to the dissolution. But it is very striking thing in the difference. And I think when people watch, when you sit down with a group of Jamaicans watching Nollywood, the things that they exclaim about, and there's, who's this chief? What is he saying? How dare he saying it into people? Or who's this elder? Oh, get away. What are you telling the people? And people, as usual, people participate in the movie, watching it. And the things which alarm them is a sort of expression, what you might call expressions of traditional authority. Alarms people, because we simply don't have it. We have elements of it, For example, when I was young and so on, you couldn't call your older brother by their first name, or your older. You had to say sister so and so, or brother so and so. This is, I think, gone now, right? You certainly couldn't you couldn't dare call your parents. I mean, this is
By name, yeah.
No. Be very careful. But the point is that it didn't have any structural authority on it. It was more a sentiment, right? So, and similar, so there's a kind of sentiment of respect for authority, respect for age, respect for certain traditions and so on, but it doesn't have a structural underpinning, right? So it doesn't have any teeth. It can't bite you. If you disappear, nothing happens. People may say, oh, you're not brought up, but no consequences flow from it. So it's an interesting thing. And, I once said, perhaps very rashly, that maybe the future of Nigeria will be one in which a similar historical process takes place. That is to say, there's a sort of unification, cultural unification of the country, which, I mean, I'm an outsider, so of course, but I would still say that I really do feel, I dearly hope that there's something of this nature would happen. But obviously, it won't happen like the way it happened in a place like Jamaica. The historical circumstances are completely different and so on. But I do feel that some analog of this is important. And I remember when I used to be on Twitter, I was sort of castigated ferociously by some, shall I say, ethnic nationalists, usually from the east of Nigeria. And because they couldn't miss the fact that I had this idea in the back of my head that there would be this sort of cultural, not uniformity, I mean, that's absurd, but a sort of a greater degree of cultural integration, let's use a word like that, than exists now, because I do believe, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I think many Nigerians also believe, that this issue remains an important problem for the country, as it is in Ghana as well, though not to the same degree, partly because Islam is not a big figure in Ghana in a way. There's no history of emirates or caliphates in Ghana at all. I mean, there's a little tip of it, but nothing. In the north, there's Imam Pusi Dagomba, but it's nowhere remotely like what I have in Nigeria. I do think that this is a serious issue, which is very difficult to resolve, obviously, but it's one which I think somehow one really, I'm not
the challenge is the challenge of our time, really, to be able to forge a common.
It's very difficult, very, very difficult. So,
okay. I want to move on to a different topic sort of now. So I came across there's a Jamaican saying, I came across a 1-1 cocoa full basket. And I thought about it. I thought to myself, like, so basically it's saying every little bit adds up, but I want to think about it in a different way. Is that also part of the trap in Africa and the Caribbean? Do policymakers take a few years of growth, say a few new roads, a few new investment announcements, and then mistake that for development? Or where exactly is the line between growth and development? And this is something that, we've talked about quite a bit, in our conversation. This is one of the most important distinctions that you always make in conversation. So basically for our listeners, I want you to go a bit further on this, for people who constantly hear GDP, investment, reform, how would you explain that difference in the plainest terms between growth and development?
Yeah, well, first of all, obviously, this is not original to me. I mean, it's an old distinction in the literature, right? So, I mean, especially Latin American structural economists, Prebisch and that group, and even before. I would explain it this way. Like, take an example, say, of use a Caribbean example, Ghana. Ghana has recently discovered oil. And as a result of that, it has experienced tremendous GDP growth. Right? Its per capita GDP has increased very rapidly. But if you examine the Guyanese economy, it has practically no manufacturing sector. Its agricultural sector is the same agricultural sector, which are very similar agricultural sector to what the British started in the 19th century. There is no, it has no internal scientific research capacity. But it basically has a lot more money, right, which the oil generates, but the economy itself, it's just the same economy with this oil enclave inserted in it. This, I think, is perhaps an extreme case, but one which allows people to understand, like also in a Nigerian context in a way, that just the presence of oil and the earnings from oil that can give you growth in your GDP, right? So you look better in the statistics. But if you look at what sometimes people like Hausman and so on call economic complexity, that is to say, put it simply in a way, what's the technological content of what you're producing? You're just a raw materials exporter, basically, when you get right down to it, right? Maybe the raw crude or maybe semi-processed crude, but actually there is no deeper change in how your economy is structured. If there's no deeper change in how your economy is structured, then you will not be able to raise the income levels of your people. It's as simple as that, right? Because you will not be, the value added that you need will not be being produced, right? Oil alone will not do it. So if you're going to, which I think is the goal of many people, yourself, if we want to change the life conditions of the people living under the bridge, let's use that phrase, right? If we want to have a permanent change in that, then we have to change the economic structure of the economy, which is to say, we've got to develop a production system which is producing more higher value added products, not just raw crude or raw cocoa or palm oil or whatever it is. And by the way, not just garments. Right? I mean, garment manufacturing. I know, Bangladesh has done very well, quote unquote, out of garment manufacturing. Right? But garment manufacturing has not transformed the Bangladesh economy. It has not developed it. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why Bangladesh is politically so unstable, right? Because the economic conditions with all of this huge textile garment sector, the economic conditions of the average person has not changed. Has not changed. And you can't change that without development, right? And this is, if we accept this idea, which is not original at all, it's been pointed out for decades and decades, right? Then the question then becomes how to bring this about. And many of the people you have interviewed and the books you've reviewed, of course, this is the principal issue in Studwell or said Durkin, right? Or this is the issue, I think myself that the big issue here is politics. We have to be careful. We can come back to that when we say politics, because this means different things, obviously, to many different people. But as I think Durkin or Asamoah and Robinson put it in a kind of more pompous way, institutions. That's just an academic way of saying politics, okay? It's politics they're talking about, institutions, right? Because, you see, it's the nature of your political elite and your economic elite, which is obviously closely interwoven with your political elite. It's their nature which is going to determine whether what they do is simply get an oil concession, right? Or some other kind of monopoly. You can name them, I won't. And simply cream off the rent from that monopolistic position. And they become billionaires. They fly around the world. They're featured in major Western newspapers, which shall be nameless. they become role models, actually. This is actually, in a way, the harmful part. They then become role models for a young Nigerian or young Ghanaian, that this is what you must aspire to become, right? And as you've often pointed out, if you look at this kind of growth model and these enterprises, you will notice that these enterprises have basically no scientific, technical research capacity whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right? Or very little. That there's very little technology transfer into the economy by the activities that they're doing, right? So that as a result, the firms really can't move up the value chain, right? So you need a monopoly. If that's the nature of your political elite, then you get growth, but you won't get development. And you'll be trotting back and forth to the bond market and the IMF and so on and so forth from pillar to post, And every now and then you'll have some upheaval from below, it's a Senegal thing or a Nepal thing or Madagascar thing or whatever. And then it subsides, and then the cycle begins again and again and again. So to break this, you have to have, in my opinion, a political, economic elite which is different. One which is vested in the development. Let me put it this way. It may disturb people when I put it this way. One which is really committed to the development of capitalism in Nigeria. I put it as ideologically as that because I think, I regard myself a person of the left and so on, right? And statements like this, of course, horrify my friends and so on. I'm too old to be worried about that. No, all right, any point. But this is what we're talking about. How do you advance capitalism? If you want to use a more neutral word, market relations, how do you create a market? You need infrastructure, obviously, you need roads, you need communication, you need business schools. You can discuss all the things we need, but none of this is likely to happen to the degree that you need it to happen unless you have a different economic and political elite. Now, it's easy for me to say that. I'm not in Nigeria, right? I am not going to be victimized. I'm not going to be hauled out by some soldier on the road and roughed up and so on. If you stick your neck out for this, you're asking for trouble. I'm not telling people anything they don't know. So naturally, people don't do it, are very cautious, wisely so. But I think that sooner or later, and the thing about it, Faye and Toby, there's so many talented people in your country. It's unbelievable, actually. It really is. You see, I have mixed feelings about it, but you see all of that drama going on in the fintech sector, right? You see all of this stuff. Another story altogether, the whole rave entertainment, Dirty December drama. There's all of this energy and creativity in the society. And some of it finds its way into the economy, but not to the degree and to the extent and to the depth which is needed. And the reason for that, I think, is because it's politically blocked in a way. But there are other groups that dominate the political and economic decision-making space. And these, in a funny way, you may not agree, but in a funny way, the raving, I think I once made this remark, to me, is a funny kind of recognition of powerlessness in a way. That in a way, listen, we have all of this talent, we have all this energy, we have all of these ideas, but the fact is, we have no means of implementing them, or very little means of implementing them fully or to the degree that we would like. So let's dance our troubles away, right? I mean, in other words, so that in a way, the cultural scene on the upper middle class cultural scene kind of reflects this sense that let's keep out of the political realm and those things because it's too dangerous, right? It is indeed. It is indeed, right? And it's foolhardy to interfere, but nonetheless, I will say that sooner or later, this challenge, somebody will have to bail this cat.
Yeah.
But this is my opinion, anyhow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to unpack from that answer. I didn't think we'll leave this podcast if I get into my follow-up questions, but I'll just move on. For a mostly Nigerian and African audience that may know the Caribbean mainly through music, migration, and tourism,
Yeah.
what do you think they and other Africans mostly misunderstand about Caribbean economic development over the last 50 years?
Well, I think people see the surface. You come for a short visit, or I see some on TV. I see the tourism, the beautiful beaches, or the tourist sector. Tourist sector in Jamaica is very developed. It's very modern. It is at a very high standard. Really, it really is a very high standard. Quite a good chunk of it is Jamaican owned, or by the elite. It's actually Sandals is a Jamaican owned company. People think it's US, but it isn't. It's a Jamaican company, right? And there are others, Esotel and all these places, these top line are Jamaican entities and so on. So I think that people see the surface of a place, perhaps, and they don't have the time or maybe the interest to dig a little deeper, that the underlying situation shares many weaknesses like what they will have in Nigeria. The education system it's thin. It's very, very good in an elite sense. The elite high school is very good, but that's a tiny minority. The vast majority of the performance of Jamaicans in math and English high school is abysmal. I mean, it's just unbelievably bad, right? The research capacity in any serious sense of scientific research is extremely weak. So that the real things which make a country develop, I think that people have little understanding of this, and you can't blame them. They watch the media or they meet some Jamaican who will give them some spiel or something like that, so that they don't have either the motivation, perhaps, or the time to dig more deeply to understand what they're dealing with. Corruption is I wouldn't say that it's corrupt society, but there is a lot. There's quite a bit of corruption in Jamaica, in all over the place, There's quite a bit of rent seeking which goes on in Jamaica. There's a tremendous speculation in real estate which takes place, So that's what I would say, that the investor from Africa would have to dig very deep and consider that the markets that he would be invested in are tiny. They're tiny, so you can't. The entire English-speaking Caribbean is 5 million people. If you add in Cuba, Dominican Republic, and so on. If you add in Dominican Republic, let's say, you might end up with 10 million people. You add in Cuba, okay, you might end up with 25, 30 million people. These markets are too small for any serious investment if you look at the region as a whole, right? So whatever is being done in a place like that has to be export-oriented. It's not export-oriented, it's not in the game. It simply can't be. But to be export-oriented, then a whole lot of other issues arise that you got to be globally competitive. Otherwise, you can kiss that goodbye. Right? So it's not a simple proposition to jump. I mean, I would love to have Nigerian investment in Jamaica, of course. I really would, because I would love it from even a social point of view. I think Jamaicans need to see, I know this is crass, but still I say, Jamaicans need to see that you have really rich Black people. You have really rich and successful Black businessmen. Jamaicans need to see this more, just to see it. Right? It may sound weird, and I know it's crass, but I think, but at the same time, caution. You have to be cautious, right? Because the markets have some serious constraints in these, just by smallness alone. So,
what have they gotten right, though? What have the Caribbean countries gotten right over the last 50 years, in terms of development?
I think one, we were very early on the Arthur Lewis thing. Arthur Lewis used Jamaica, that famous article on, unlimited supplies of labor was the Jamaican economy he was talking about. So actually, Jamaica started on the path of manufacturing quite early, import substitution, basically. Didn't transition to export-oriented, and all the classical problems then came up. But as a result of that, Jamaica got a certain level of what you could call, in a limited way, process knowledge, right? In the labor force, in certain manufacturing processes, but not at a very high technical level. And it also got a very capable professional middle class, right? Those, to me, are some of the very important things that we have. And culturally, Jamaica is more, Jamaica will strike you as more similar to Ghana, because the Ghanaian influence is more obvious, Ghanaian words, patois, and, kreng kreng and all this stuff. People use these words and know what they are. But many people have been to, Jamaicans have been to Ghana and Nigeria, while Ghana strikes them just like Jamaica, and Ghanaians say the same thing. The Jamaican attitude is closer to the Nigerian one. And I don't want to say this. At least the Lagos one. I don't want to Nigeria. So people are in your face. They are assertive. They will say things they won't hold back. They tell you exactly what, you will know where you stand with them. That is for sure. Right? So that this assertive quality, to me, is a kind of Nigerian, at least a Lagos quality in a way. You don't have it in Accra. You don't have it. Accra, it reminds me more of Barbados, where you have, again, a sort of more reserved, low key, not this in your face Jamaican thing. I think that this is a very important positive quality for society to have, because I think this is what causes a society to develop and to transform itself. It's this kind of energy and assertiveness. One of the problems with academic analyses of development is that it's described as if it's a kind of university seminar, some experts got together and they thought about the problem, analyzed it carefully, collected the data, applied it, and developed. It's a political struggle of enormous proportions. And if you read the history, remember, Faye, we spoke about this, like, for example, the Japanese experience in the 19th century and the early 20th, I mean, extraordinarily violent, right? Really unbelievable. People forget this, It's as if Japan just took off. They engaged the takeoff gear. The guy lifted up the wheels, and the plane just took. Would it hurt so? I mean, that's just jokes, right? So that this assertive quality, this quality you see in Nigeria, at least it's certainly in Lagos, not only Lagos, but probably other parts of the country, but certainly particularly strong in Lagos. You see it in Jamaica too. And it is this, to me, this helter-skelter, rough and ready, in your face pushiness that actually develops a country. That's what it really is, The problem is when this attitude and this orientation is directed to real estate speculation, for example, or to, shall I use your Yahoo, as you would put it, where all of this creativity and this impulse, right, doesn't find an outlet, right, in the economic macroeconomy of the country. It is buckled, it is prevented, right, from finding or maybe that's too strong a word, but it's circumscribed. If you know what I mean. Its avenues are narrowed, so naturally, it can't express itself. But this is actually, to me, the priceless source of the potential for development in your country as it is in ours. And may we keep this very strong, assertive quality. It is our home. That is our home, right? It can be crude. It can be offensive from time to time. But also that is the heart of where all creativity lies. And without that, the development potential, which is present in every culture, the rationality which is present in every culture. Rationality is not a peculiar Western cultures. Every culture contains rational components. The question is, do those rational components become the predominant feature of life, the determinant feature of life? Does this sort of individualistic, aggressive pushiness, the desire to accumulate and to improve and continue to accumulate. This is what development really is. It's not a university seminar, okay? It's not. And I think this is a priceless quality as far as I'm concerned. And you have it, and you should cherish it, if you don't mind my saying so.
Thank you. Okay, that's a really good one. I want to take you back, something you've mentioned already, but I just wanted to take you back to talk about it a bit more. So you always talk about the social character of the ruling elite. It can sound a bit nebulous, but I wanted to flesh it out a bit for us. So when you compare places like, say, Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, and Barbados, what kind of elites or coalitions have historically been capable of bringing about development? And conversely, what kind of coalitions are almost guaranteed to block? I think you've covered that already, but I think maybe we want the kind of elites that can bring about development. And you can name names if you want.
Well, I don't know if I have enough names to name, but still, this thing though, it's connected to formation. Your book, the book that you and Fuller wrote, we all suffered because of the lack of business creativity of British colonialism. We all suffered from this, right? So the British, especially in the 20th century period, right? The British, of course, had lost their own entrepreneurial creativity by after World War I, the sort of, the whole free trade thing and so on, the debate. And everybody wanted to be a country gentleman. Lugard wanted to be a lord, and so he became a lord. Good for him, right? But our common British experience created for all of us a kind of bureaucratic colonial state. We still have parts of it. We still have a lot of it, right? And this is throughout the Caribbean. Jamaica can be very bureaucratic. It takes ages to get things approved. Funds are voted. They're there, they sit down, they're not disbursed. The government laments this every single day. We all have, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Nigeria too has huge bureaucratic problems, right? So one of the things is we've got to get to completely reform these state apparatuses which we have, right, and make them much more efficient, much more business oriented, and use them more so that they can promote markets, so they can promote capitalist development. Okay. On the social character issue, we need in Barbados in particular, but also in Jamaica, the business elites background is in mercantile activities, right? Import, export, buying and selling, and then plantation activity. Right? They really have little or no experience. To get them into manufacturing was a very big thing, very difficult, right? To get them to invest in anything which is value added, it's very, very difficult. They will invest. In fact, there's a Jamaican firm which is done. They will invest in a European firm, actually. They'll do an acquisition of a European firm, right? And that firm, which is up high in the value chain in Europe, will simply be operated at an arm's length. There'll be no technology transfer to Jamaica. Only dividends are transferred, nothing else, right? So that there's a mentality of rent seeking, which is very, very deep, because I think of this mercantile and sort of trading origin. I think this is similar, perhaps in Nigeria, may even be in West Africa, not just Nigeria. There's a tremendous trading ethic, so that people think that buying and selling is a crux of capitalism, but it isn't. Of course, markets obviously are crucial, right? But the idea that the social type you want is a type who will not buy and sell and make margins off that, but somebody who's oriented to taking risks, taking the profits from trade, investing them in manufacturing, right, or in modernizing agriculture, right? In other words, moving into the process now of production, right? So that the difficulty is that you get an elite socially, which is in finance, both Jamaica and in Nigeria. You get an elite which is quite strong in trading. You get an elite which is also, in your case, able to control certain rent-seeking activities, especially via oil and monopolistic import substitution type arrangements, right? So that's their social character. They're accustomed to relatively easy money, if you want to say, creaming it off from the top. They're not accustomed to risking their shirt, right? Putting down their money into something as difficult as, let's say, agriculture, right? Export agriculture. They're not interested in trying to develop, or I would say not interested. They're very cagey, very careful in trying to develop firms which are regionally competitive, let's say, unless they're given profit guarantees of monopolistic rights in the particular market, right? They're not willing to go into a market by purely economic strength and efficiency strength and productivity strength and conquer markets that way and beat out competitors that way. That's not in them. They're not into that. That's dangerous stuff, right? So we have, socially speaking, an kind of easy profit elite, right? Not so much a risk-taking elite, as I see it. And that elite are willing to develop big firms, have developed large firms, but those large firms have to be cushioned by a whole set of protective arrangements, even when they expand. If they go into another country, they go into that other country not because they're globally competitive or regionally competitive. They go there because they're again promised a whole set of protections, right, which cushions them from competitiveness, right? So this is I like to say, people talk about Mansa Musa. This is going back to 1450s or whatever it is, earlier than that, 13th century, right? And they celebrate Mansa Musa. Okay, all right. I will celebrate Mansa Musa too. But the striking thing to me, about Mansa Musa is that this thing is a trading regime. So you're trading all this gold and you're going to Cairo and everybody's impressed and you have all this retinue and all of these people and so on and so forth. Right? That's great. But at the end of the day, when the Moroccans then come in 91, right, and invade Shanghai, they bring a cannon. But what Shanghai has a bigger army, but they have arrows and lances, right? That this gold, this trading in gold has not transformed the internal economy. And in fact, it's celebrated as a tremendous thing that this is the ideal, the social ideal. I would love to see somebody write a novel on this in Nigeria or Ghana or a play. The social ideal is a person who is grandiloquent, showy, has a long list of titles, who is extravagant, who, will, what do you call it, spray huge amounts of money on people, right? This is the social ideal. The social ideal about if a businessman in Nigeria was restrained, did not spray, wasn't showy, lived relatively modestly. I'm not saying in poverty, but relatively modestly, right? A person regarded as stingy. Stingy. That would be the word that could be used, right? Stinginess is an problem. Whereas, if you go back, of course, to the Industrial Revolution, stinginess was a hallmark of capital accumulation, right?
Yeah.
That is what thing there was. The guy in Dickens's novel was stingy. I mean, you can't get more stingy than that guy. I don't remember his name now, right? But in other words, the social and cultural ideal is not oriented to championing the risk taker, the person oriented towards investment, the person who is building for the future. That's not the ideal. The ideal is a person who is grand, extravagant, and generous, and all of these things. I'm not saying these are all bad qualities, but I do think that if that's your social and cultural ideal, right, the emphasis is misplaced. Let me put it that way. Right? Emphasis is misplaced. But I don't know. I mean, that's still vague, but that's as far as I'm able to go at the moment, I think.
I mean, in I don't know if you remember this, in preparation for a previous conversation that didn't happen, I happened to come across your old book, well, old relatively, Culture, Society, and Economy,
Yeah.
Bringing Production Back in. And again, in preparation for this conversation, I was rereading parts of it,
Yeah.
and I still consider it to be truly underrated because it was so prescient in its analysis. We are currently living at a time when the foundational roots of capitalism and globalization are being questioned. And these are the things you wrote about in that book. You argued that much of cultural theory correctly rejected crude economism, or Homo economicus as it is, but then overcorrected into economic illiteracy. Looking back now, especially with the rising appeal of communism amongst young people and dissatisfaction with consumptive inequality, so to speak,
Yeah.
and the charge that capitalism is somehow culturally degenerate, where do you think the balance should be struck between autonomy of culture and the explanatory primacy of production?
Well, to me, production is the crux of it. And here's the thing, right? This question of westernization, if you want to put it that way, cultural westernization, here's the thing. Every culture, I've been thinking about this, because of the whole debate about, civilization, this and that, and what have you. I don't like the word civilization because too much baggage, but set that aside. Here's the thing, that the culture, every single one, right, has its own potential for capitalism. Every single one has its own potential for rationality. It's not a matter of bringing it from outside. You can bring it from outside. You can get all kinds of things from outside. You can get foreign investment, blah, 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 foreign technology, of course, and you should. You should. But the key challenge is, how do you indigenize this? Or how do you internalize it? How do you connect it with your own traditions of rationality and your own traditions of capitalism? How do you transform your society and your culture from within? So you can get you should get the foreign aid and the foreign assistance and the foreign thing. In fact, you should take as much of the foreign technology as you can get, legally or illegally. I have no constraints on that front, right? As far as I'm concerned, intellectual property should be forgotten and so on, right? But because it's a kind of contradiction in terms of intellectual property, very strange concept. But still, it's not a matter of you can bring anything you want from outside, but does it take root? Does it take root? That's the question. For it to take root, and this is where research comes into, for it to take root, Toby, you have to develop a deep understanding of your own society. And this requires research, serious detail. There's quite a bit of research in Nigeria. I started reading up. I haven't read enough of it. I wish I, had read more, but there's quite a lot of interesting work being done. I remember the name. I think it's a Yoruba name of Fakai or something like that. Jerome. But he works on like indigenous technology and the problem of scaling up small enterprises in Nigeria. And I think some of this work was done in Enugu, or some of it was done in ways that we pronounce it in the Innoson places and so on. So there is research taking place now, and more power to them, and it needs more funding and more support and more recognition, and also more outlets in Nigerian media, because a lot of this flows into Western media, which is all well and good. People need to get promoted. so that they need to be in referee journals. I understand this. I've been through this all my life. I understand that, right? But Nigeria, and it's really important to deepen the quality of business research. It really is important. People got to understand what is the experience of trying to upgrade technology in small firms or larger firms. What is the experience? Take agriculture and the land tenure question. It's obviously a monster of a problem. I mean, it really is a big problem, right? But have there been attempts to resolve it? Have there been attempts to address it? There must be attempts. There must have been people who tried to find a way through the thicket of traditional land tenure and all of that. There must be cases of that. In fact, there probably are a lot of cases of it, right? I don't know, but I just feel there must be. I mean, Nigerians are too entrepreneurial, and people must have tried this thing and probably still are trying it in the hundreds or maybe even thousands. But it doesn't, we don't have good research on this thing. We can't extract any general lessons from it so that the next round of efforts are at a different level. And we build on that and we improve it, right? So because the university is a British setup, I mean, God bless them and so on. I went to one myself. These were basically undergraduate colleges. They were not research universities, right? So that the universities in Caribbean and in West Africa have a real struggle to make themselves into research institutions because they were not designed, they're not set up that way. South Africa is different because, of course, the Boers and the Cape Town bourgeoisie were not joking, they were not playing, right? So they set up Cape Town and WITS in particular to be research universities. They are very powerful research institutions, especially in biomedicine in South Africa. But outside of that, the universities are weak. The research processes are weak. We don't have enough financial support for good quality researchers. They don't have enough outlets for their work in the country, right? There's a tremendous things which could be done. Engineers, look how many engineers you have, right? I mean, highly technically, people can hold their own anywhere in the world. In fact, this is why they can migrate to Canada and what have you, because obviously the level is at the internationally competitive level. How can we support them more? How can we get them more into entrepreneurial investment activities to upgrade agricultural technology? There's a lot of small-scale farming technology available in Asia, in particular in Japan and in China, for that matter. But I think we're not doing enough. We're not doing nearly enough in the research area, right? Because frankly speaking, there's very little financial support for it. So if people have teaching loads or whatever, umpteen courses per semester and so on, which research you're talking about, it won't take place, right? They've got to be relieved from the teaching. For them to relieve from the teaching, there has to be finance for it, right? And so we've got to build, when these guys like Durkheim or Acemoglu and so on, when they talk about institutions, this is what they're talking about, really. This is the down and dirty of what they're really talking about. We've got to get more deeply into understanding our own indigenous context, right? Because if we don't understand it, we won't be able to get modern technology to take root. We won't be able to, because you see, it has to connect. It can't be just brought in like an enclave and just dropped down, right?
Mm-hmm.
It has to be embraced. It has to be embraced. For it to be embraced, it's got to connect with people. People need to understand it, to see it from their point of view, to connect with it, for them to connect with it, right? You've got to see You, the researcher, has got to show them these are the points of connection. This is how you can connect it. No, it's a trial and error thing, Again, this is a problem with the development literature. You have a seminar, you solve the problem. Listen, it's a trial and error thing. Mistake upon mistake upon mistake is made. But you learn from them. You learn from them. That's the point. But you can't learn from them without a research apparatus to have this learning institutionalized, to connect this learning to business enterprises, to pass on this to another generation of entrepreneurs and researchers. All of these things. I think, actually, if I may be so bold to say, I think that some of this can be done without waiting on the political authorities. I think it can be done. For example, why couldn't the professional engineers in Nigeria move more in this direction? I think they could, right? It's not political. It's not contesting no election. It's not trying to take power from X or Y, It's not ending SARS or nothing like that. I mean, it's technological, it's research, right? It's neutral stuff, right? So I think that the thing is, I think that more can be done without incurring political risks of a frontal assault on the order, which would be fatal. That would be absolutely fatal. You once, I don't know if I once had a discussion, and it comes back to when you had. I once had a discussion with someone two different people, and we were discussing the slave trade and slavery. And both these persons actually are, let's how to put it out, I don't want to get names, I don't want people to speculate. But like many other people in Nigeria, right? And like many other professionals in Nigeria, they have connections with traditional authority. And we're discussing the slave trade. And like many other people in Nigeria, these traditional authorities played a major role in the 18th century slave trade. So that these people said to me, this is a real stain. This is a serious stain. And it causes me anguish. This is your Nigerian friend saying to me, it brings me great anguish. And I said, I understand this, and I appreciate this. And I really do appreciate it. And this comes back to the Ghana-Nigeria difference in a way on this issue, the slavery and the slave trade. And they said to me, two of them said to me, I'm going to confront the elders on this. And I said, I understand where you're coming from, but I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea. Anyhow, since they're Nigerians, of course, they ignored me completely, right? And they went ahead in a headstrong way. And they were very upset about this. And I tried to say, listen, we can't approach the issue of this enormous global historical significance as a family issue. You can't approach it that way. It's too big for that, right? This society as a whole, not your elders, the society as a whole, broadly speaking, has got to make its own peace with this issue, has got to confront this issue as a society. You can't expect that you single out your family, because your family ancestrally is positioned today is partly a result of the wealth acquired through this process to some degree. It's not going to work, and it can't work, right? But I understand the anguish, and it's and I appreciate it. It's a tremendous testimony to their high ethical personal qualities. This anguish.
Yeah.
But it can't work. It can't work, right? Because the problem is deep than this, right? It really is. But what that I wanted to say, and that's what's that. But I mean, is you have so many, obviously, the two of you are examples of this enormous talent and ability and grasp of the situation. Simply enormous. You don't have the same other countries or this often exists in foreign countries. It's existing there. I don't see it in Kenya already. This funny, this kind of involved and intellectual persistence is a kind of peculiar Nigerian quality. It's really treasure it. But a way needs to be carried forward without some political confrontation. And to me, there's just a lot of room for in which sort of professional associations, there was a guy, I don't remember his name, he's a guy, I think he was in furniture. I don't remember whether he was in, but he was doing some very interesting things, trying to modernize furniture manufacturing, indigenously modernize it, not bringing this awful express-looking stuff from Malaysia and to buy, which people have their idea to a lot of that, where it was such a right? But trying to modernize the technology of it and documenting it. I don't know, I've lost touch with all of that. This is priceless stuff. It truly is priceless stuff. Yeah? The stuff that there's a company which does, what do they call it? They do a kind of something dye lab. I
I
think
love
it is
you. Yeah.
a interesting company. I thought of trying to penetrate, I think, the British market. And I think, as I understand it, actually, there's more, I don't know if they're doing the Asian market, there are enormous prospects of this kind of in the Asian market. You know, such a lot rapidly growing upper middle class, Asian upper middle class. You just lap up this stuff, in my opinion. But it needs support, not them personally, but this kind of activity, which is, to me, much more capitalist oriented, investment oriented, risk-taking, innovative, new, trying to lift the level of quality of product, competing on quality, really, design, and these kinds of things. This needs more support, more organized support. And I think it's possible for this to be done without creating any big political drama of any kind. Right? And I do hope that people find a way to do it, because the success of these things is, of course, the doing of it. People see it and they didn't know. They didn't know that despite all the madness in land tenure, I never knew you could modernize, would have such a modern farm running so efficiently, so productively, right? And not just raw things, but industrialization of freshness and all this fancy stuff which is going on elsewhere, in Peru and so on. Why is Peru able to do it? Why is Peru and Chile able to, send blueberries to Florida?
Yeah.
Why are they able to do it? Right? They don't have the constraints you have, right? But you have the potential to do it. And I think there may well be people already trying to do it, which we don't know anything about, right? We haven't researched them, we haven't connected with them. There's no institutional structure, to use a fancy language, to support them, right? To, all of these things, I really think. Um, so in a paradoxical kind of way, I'm kind of optimistic about Nigeria. I know this may sound absurd to many people. I am. I mean, yeah, you can say you're thousands of miles away. Of course, you can be optimistic. Um, okay, I know that. I understand that, but it's not based just on sentiment. It is based upon the fact that you have. When I first went, not the first time, second time. First I went to Nigeria actually during the Civil War. That's another story, right? But second time when I came back, I was quite amazed at how big the professional class was. Right? I was surprised. I really was surprised at how big it is, and that's decade and more ago. So it's much bigger now. Has a much higher level of skill now. Has accumulated a lot more experience now. So I do think that there is a resource there, which um, I think skillfully and so on.
Yeah.
What did
Yeah.
man say? Crossing the river, feeling the stones, or whatever it is.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
That's how I think about that, anyhow.
Okay. Okay. Good stuff. Yeah. Okay. I want to quickly pull you back on something you said earlier. Well, topic of slavery. I think we want to talk about that as
And,
well. So
yeah.
you've made I think in the past you've made a sharp distinction between how Ghana sometimes packages slavery for a liberal diaspora audience, while Nigeria can be brutally unsentimental about it. Now, those are sort of two extremes. So, but I wanted to ask you, where is the middle ground? What would be an honest African Caribbean history of slavery sound like? One that is neither too sentimental or does not evade complicity. Where is the middle ground and the honest way, basically?
Well, it's not a tough one, The first, we've got to, first of all, make a commitment to be truthful about what actually took place. We've got to do it. I went and looked on the slave compensation database in London because I wanted to see if any of my family was compensated. And yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. At least I don't know the exact relation, but I'm sure the person is related to me. She carries my surname, and so on. I carry her surname. But for two enslaved persons was compensated out of that money. So I am not in a position to adopt a self-righteous attitude to it. Right? We've got to be truthful. We have to say what happened, right? And how it transpired, and why it lasted so long, and what the impact of it was in both places. I think we have a fairly good idea of what the domestic impact of it was in the Caribbean. We don't have an equally deep research and study of what was the impact of the slave trade internal to Nigeria, internal to Ghana. We don't. I saw a little bit of it in that thing that you wrote the other day, right? In which you're talking about how the slave trade led to a dispersal of the rural population. I'm sure it did. Um, they, you know, I remember one sending you a copy of that picture of this slave raiding exercise. It was in Chad, around Lake Chad.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a horrendous sight, you know. This is in the 18th century, so it's sort of or from the Kanura area, but further off, it's not, and further east on the other side of the ocean. And people are fleeing up in trees. They're hiding in the top of the tree. The entire village, retreat up into the top of the tree, a huge tree. And the raiding group below, no Europeans, all Africans. The raiding group below is lending siege to the tree and waiting them out. And of course, eventually they have to come down and they are just slaughtered, right? The men may be slaughtered or sold into slavery, the woman will be whatever, and so on. So you can imagine, these are groups which still exist in Chad to this day, right? You can imagine the historical memory of this. In northern Ghana, there is quite a bit of bitterness amongst scholars of northern Ghana origin on this slave trade mainly towards the Ashantis, because of course Ashantis conquered them and sold them into slavery. Right? I don't think you can understand the dynamics of a relationship between the north of Ghana today to the south, right? Without going back into the 18th century slave trade. I don't think you can understand the depth of ethnic divisiveness in Nigeria without going back to the slave trade, because during the slave trade, it's every group for itself, every village for itself, right? People raiding each other. I mean, this is a tremendous socio-violent upheaval, which is constant, everyday feature of everyday life, right? So this has a deeply undermining effect, right? It's the pre-colonial period, of course, right? So before colonial conquest, before Lugard and all these people. So I believe that a key thing is simply a truthful, detailed account of what happened. On our side in the Caribbean too, I think I mentioned once to you, during the big slave revolt in the 1750s, 1751, big one of the biggest ones. One of the groups the British had to suppress the revolt was the so-called King's Negroes. The King's Negroes. That's what they're called. Right? This is a group of enslaved Africans in Jamaica who fight on the British side, not Maroons, who fight on the British side, right, to capture and suppress people revolting to get out of slavery. Okay. No, that's a minority. But we've got to tell the truth about our history to ourselves and to our children. That's number one. I think that is the foundation for anything going forward. Right? In the Ghanaian case, they tend, I'm uncomfortable with how they deal with it, They tend to minimize their own role in it. They tend to, it's all the white man and so on. Listen, if you know Cape Coast, right, you know that there's no harbor. The ships have to anchor out. So people are being enslaved have to be taken in canoes from the sand, from the beach out to the ship, where the ship is ready. Sometimes the ship will be anchored there for almost 6 months, even more, right? Where more and more people are brought. So it's not like a quick in and out thing, right? It's an organized thing. People will jump out of the canoes and attempt to run back on the shore. So they had Ghanaians who they called sand men. And a sand man was somebody, an African, a Ghanaian, who stood on the shore, right, and pushed people back into the canoe and sent them back onto the boat and sent them back onto the ship. Okay. We need to hear these things. We need to understand these things without it producing acrimony, without it producing hatred or acrimony, which is forget that. That's old. Just so we need to just stare the truth, right, in its face, right? And to recognize this truth as one terrible period in our mutual history. To me, that's the basis for any kind of adequate treatment of it. Then you've got to, you can't. I'm uncomfortable with this sort of tourist industry around Cape Coast Castle and stuff. I can see museums and all of these things, and I'm not saying you shouldn't have anything at all. Obviously, you need memorials, but you have to be very careful that you don't commoditize it. I mean, this is an era we should not have no capitalist penetration in this area. I know. This is too deep in its impact on our mutual histories to this day. So we have to treat this slave trade and And one of the things which became very clear to me when I was in Ghana donkeys years ago and got to know people and got very involved in family life. And, if you get into family life, and of course, you get to understand that nearly every family had some slaves. Nearly every family had one or two. This is why you will hear somebody in Nigeria say, "Don't treat me like a slave. You think I'm a slave? Don't treat me like a slave," because during the slave trade period, right, it's not, and this is commented on in the literature, and people even celebrate it, that was different from plantation slavery. Of course it was different from plantation slavery, domestic slavery, but it was slavery, for sure. Right? So all of this attitude, which you see in Nigeria, where people slap a worker in a household worker, this attitude that you can treat people a certain way. This to me is a direct product of the whole slave trade experience, right? Where these people are really just an inch above slavery in the mind of, so you're working in somebody's, your gate man, and so they call you Musa. I mean, you may not even be Muslim, and I still call you Musa. The thing is really something else, right? These are products of slavery and the slave trade, right? You slap the person, or you can't. I used to have these instances. Guy comes in, friend in a person's home, comes in. He's like, "Oh God!" So of course he drives him. He's sitting, come out of the back of his SUV. He has several SUVs, not one. One is too little, he's more than one. Right? His family are three, but I need 4 cars. And set at aside. Right? He comes out, steps out of his SUV. Then the gate man has to carry his valise. He cannot carry it. His valise is so weighty. He cannot carry it himself. He strides in, emperor. Oh God. And he goes in and he sits down and he wants a glass of water. There's an ultra-modern Samsung fridge in front of him, right, with a water dispenser. He does not get up and go to this ultra-modern Samsung fridge with see-through door and all the kinds of stuff and turn on the dispenser and get that water. He calls out to a servant, "I want water." And this poor person has to come, go to this refrigerator, turn on the thing, bring the water, and bring it to Olga. And then, this is the pièce de resistance, which used to drive us crazy. When we see this, it drive us crazy. And my wife would go mad. This is just madness. Just a kind of little curtsy. You know what I mean? When they present in the water, there's a little sort of... And she would say, "Well, what the hell is this? What the hell?" And she would say it. I mean, typical Jamaican, let it all hang out. And you challenge a guy and say, "What the hell you doing? What the hell you think you're doing?" In those words, "What the hell you doing?" And he would laugh and say, "This is Africa." End of story, right? Okay. No, these are extreme cases and so on and so forth, and a lot has changed, a lot of is changing, and it has changed. But these are, to me, just small remnants of the effect of the slave trade internally on the society. And I think we need more research. We have some, quite a bit of research on the internal slave trade in Nigeria, on the eastern side. But it tends to be in terms of ethnic origins. It doesn't discuss that much the internal effect on the culture and the society. I mean, there's a little thing, I think that guy did something on also, or of Anugu, and so on, and the development of this kind of thing. But these are all things which are products of the slave trade. Right? So what we need first and foremost, before we can discuss anything else, is simply an honest and truthful uh, confrontation with what actually happened and what is the actual effect of it on our societies. And this will be painful, of course, will be controversial, of course. Some people will object very strenuously, of course, but I don't see any other way. And I think it will be best done as a kind of joint project, a joint activity between scholars in Nigeria and Ghana and scholars in the Caribbean, right? Because, for one thing, take this issue which everybody's interested in, as to who came from where, how many people, who's of Nigeria. People keep doing this useless DNA test, but the point, I keep doing them. Anyhow, that's good for them. But we can't make more headway, and there are all kind of statistical analyses of where shipments left from at what time and all these kinds of things. But really, the big bottleneck in getting more real concrete knowledge on the origins of people is the absence of African researchers in this field. So that we don't even recognize the names. They would immediately Moko in Jamaica is a Ibibio, right? But people would know that, right? Jamaicans don't know that. Jamaicans have no idea what Moko means. They just know it's a place synonymous with people of African origin. That's Moko is, right? They don't know Moko was a term in the 18th century for Ibibio. They don't know anything like that. Right? So there needs to be scholarly collaboration between your scholars and our scholars, right? And not just that, but more broadly, Western scholars, I don't think we should approach this thing. This is too big an issue to narrow down to a sort of Caribbean. It should be open to anybody who wants to participate, because the slave trade was something which shaped the entire globe. It doesn't just shape West Africa. It doesn't just shape the Caribbean. It shapes the entire. The only, in a way, the only thing that corresponds to it in its historical significance in the recent period is the expansion of the East Indian companies across the Indian Ocean to Asia and so on. But in the modern period, this is absolutely historically central, so that we should have scholars. The main effort should be our scholars, but we should welcome people in an open spirit, because it's a human event. It's a human tragedy of enormous proportions, and nobody who wants to participate in understanding it should be prohibited or excluded because of some sort of racial thing or whatever. I'm not into that. So that's my view on it.
Despite the obvious historical intimacy, there is, to pick up from where you stopped, there is still remarkably little intellectual traffic, so to speak, between Africa and the Caribbean. Yeah. Why has that conversation remained so thin Is it a question of skill, class, academic dependence of Britain and the United States, which, cuts everyone else out? Or the general dominance of American framing? Or is it something more psychological? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a mixture of things, part of it, what you say, that, the Western world dominates academia. Now, if you want to be published, you want to advance your career, if you want funding, that's where it is. If you want prestige, that's where it is. So that's, how it lines up. But there's also an issue that in the Caribbean side, I don't know about it on the African side, but on the Caribbean side, we've defined, it's really something, we defined Caribbean history, right, as not African. I mean, until recently. It's really that we're Caribbean. In fact, this is the whole thing about the Black Atlantic stuff, right? That once you leave the shore and you go into the Atlantic, bye-bye Africa. It's left behind. You're now in the Atlantic. You're not in Africa no more. Yeah, poor Africa. Too bad. That's ancient history. Now you're in the Atlantic, and soon you'll be in the Caribbean. Right? So that the boundary of what Caribbean history was defined almost in opposition to African history. That's the academic disciplinary boundary. Right? So if you're going into a university and you're studying Caribbean history, you don't learn nothing about Nigeria. You don't know. You know that there's this big country up there with all these people, and the British control it, and there's other one called Ghana and so forth. But that's not part of your history. Your history begins where that ends. Right? So Caribbean history, these are quite explicit statements by renowned Caribbean historians, very eminent ones. So some of them taught me. Even when Walter Rodney was doing history, this is why it's so interesting, when Walter was doing history at the University of West Indies, that's the concept of Caribbean history that he would have taught, right? But being the person who he was and the development sort of Pan-African consciousness at the time, it was when he went to London that he did his PhD on the Upper Guinea coast, right? So it speaks volumes that he would not have been able or encouraged to do a PhD on an African topic if he had stayed in the Caribbean, because that was not Caribbean history. Okay. I think that paradigm now has broken down, right? But it has broken down without any intellectual analysis of what it was, why it was, how it came about, and what is to replace it. But it has broken down. It's broken down because, largely because of the reparations movement. So the reparations movement now it makes no sense. If I mean, or you're going to talk about reparations, you don't talk about Africa, right? So therefore, it don't make no sense. So some of my best friends, what Leader said, right, are leaders in the reparations movement. Okay. But nonetheless, right, and very distinguished scholars, but scholars of Caribbean history. We have no distinguished scholars in the Caribbean, as far as I know, of African history. Yeah? I can't think of one. Yeah? Including among people who are leaders in reparations studies. Right? And it's really funny. The academic connections are more with the South African universities. There is some there was some attempt to set up something with Ibadan, and I'm not sure what happened to that, right? But there were more with the South African universities, South Africa was the flavor du jour. I mean, that was it. You don't do anything in Africa is South Africa, blah, 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 right? But not West Africa. So that we ourselves, we have, however, naturally, Nigerian again. We have Nigerian historians in Jamaica now. And this is really interesting. Yes, who was actually dean of the Faculty of Humanities, right? And Rory Boko is his name, Rory Boko. And he did his dissertation on Jamaican missionaries who went back to Nigeria, right? In after emancipation in the 19th century. So Calabar, Calabar in Jamaica, Calabar in Calabar. That guy, what's his name again? That missionary who was active in Calabar was also active in Jamaica. I forget his name now. Very well known. He had been Welsh. I'm not sure where he was. But that's why we have a Calabar High School in Jamaica. You have Calabar, because it's based upon the two.
Was that Hopewell?
Hope Waddell. Hope
Waddell, that's the one, yeah.
Was based in Jamaica and also in Calabar, right? So there are these connections, right? But it was Waraboko, it was a Nigerian who came to Jamaica and a historian who did work on African history, right? But again, it's interesting and good work and very important, right? That's a very important period. There's a whole period after emancipation in the 1840s where people went to Nigeria, went to Cameroon. Very famous guy went to Cameroon, Jamaican guy, right? To converted people to Christianity. Very important in Western Cameroon development, in terms of education and so on. This is an emancipated slave from Jamaica, right? Who goes there. It's somewhat like the same guy who does the bread thing in the case that you wrote about.
Yeah.
Right? Shackelford. But again, if you look at it, it's sort of is not studying African history in its own right. It's not studying Nigerian history. It's not somebody doing a thing on Nigerian history in its own right. It's a study of the connection between the Caribbean and Nigeria. That's good. But what we want is people, at least what I would, John, I want people in the Caribbean who simply study Nigerian history, independent of any connection to the Caribbean. And I want people in Nigeria who study Caribbean history, independent of any connection to slave trade. They study, just like how somebody come from North America and study Caribbean history, right? Or somebody will come from UK and study Nigerian history. I want somebody from Nigeria to study Caribbean history in its own right. And similarly, vice versa. So to build up an expert, you see, Faye and Toby, one of the things we have to try hard to avoid, I know it's not easy, is narrowness. It's easy to relapse into narrowness. Yeah, it's very easy. Because, and I understand it, because the things which happened historically were so grave and the wounds are so deep that, of course, they carry deep emotions, and they should. Right? But at the end of the day, it's like that tradition in Nigeria, watching Nollywood movies, and the guy says, forgive me. The person has done some horrendous thing, but insists on being forgiven. I mean, I'll never forget one of the first ones we watched, the guy, I think it was adultery. So she was at the gate, right? And she came to the husband and said, oh, forgive me, the thing. And she kneels down and said, forgive me. And he said, I've forgiven you. I forgive you. I've forgiven you. So, no. And then she attempts to go through to the gate and said, where you headed? You said, keep going. She said, but you forgive me. I said, yes, I forgive you. But keep out. I mean, it's hilarious stuff, right? But people feel passionately and deeply and causes great anguish, and it must, but and sometimes this leads over into narrowness and narrow-mindedness and exclusions. We should try and avoid this, we should try to be inclusive and to be broad, which is why I don't like all this civilization talk crap, because I think it's inward looking too much for I'm uncomfortable. I'm a humanist, whatever the hell you want to call that, so I don't like anything that gets too inward looking and narrowing. You have to find a way to celebrate what you stand for and your traditions, and without being narrow and excluding others, and without respecting others, right? And not just tolerating them, but truly appreciating them. And this is important, I think, especially in today's world, where it speaks for itself. It's really important that we have an approach which is inclusive. So we have to be careful, that we inadvertently, we don't sort of slip into something which is saying, well, you go your way and I will go your civilization, I have my civilization. And, we may clash or we may not clash, but, there's no underlying humanity across, or very little underlying humanity across so-called civilization boundaries and so on, which I don't swallow for a minute. This whole concept is a 19th century German concept, by the way. This whole approach is a 19th century German approach, which I don't buy for 1 minute. Anyhow.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to come to our last question now. And it's more kind of like a forward-looking one, because obviously we've covered a lot of ground today. And I wanted to ask you, so looking 20 or 30 years ahead, right? Are you more hopeful about an intellectual revolution? This is something that we've discussed quite a bit, so, I mean, are you hopeful of an intellectual revolution or an economic transformation in Africa and the Caribbean? Where do you see the first real breakthrough coming from? And in your view, what are the things that we should be careful of as false dawns, that we should not be fooled by false dawn, but
I think it's much more likely in Africa than in the Caribbean, partly because of geopolitical reasons. We are much more constrained than you are, but also because of the scale that intellectual transformations, that the kind that we need, require a certain scale, it shows a certain size of intelligentsia, a certain differentiation in intelligentsia. And also, there's another thing which I think is important, why I think it's Africa. Because to put it this way, I use this European language anyhow, who cares? The acuteness of the contradictions in a place like Nigeria are so severe. They really are severe. You have, on the one hand, you have the latest sort of hippest fintech stuff going on in parts of Lagos and maybe, and so on. On the other hand, you have feudalism in certain parts of the country, large parts of the country, shall I say, right? And you have all kinds of different things in between, right? You have, billionaires, and you have indescribable rural poverty, right? Hunger side by side with consumption. There's a very insulting thing, by the way, on India. I didn't like it, but I know they were saying India, 25 million out of India population, only 25 million live in Australia. What I mean is Australian levels, right? And then the person then said, and then another somewhere in a million are living
or something,
Philippines, this other thing.
Yeah.
And then guess what? the analogy now is where you think the analogy is going. Of course, it's going down, right? Sub-Saharan Africa, said I, is quite specific, right? But the vast majority of India is living in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, it was so offensive, so offensive. You know, it's like when people do these throwaway lines about the third world, this and third world that. But anyway, set that aside. The point here is, though, because things, and then worst of all, you have this ridiculous British heritage. I mean, talking an albatross, indescribable albatross, but you have it, right? It's not totally an albatross, don't get me wrong. You know, it also has obviously positive contributions and so on. So that you have a system, a situation in which things are much more knotted up than in the Caribbean, and therefore the motive to push through is deeper, and the solutions that people are likely to come up with are likely to be more profound and thorough, because the context in which you are hitting your head against that wall, right, is a harder wall, right? And it will break many heads, this is true, but it won't break all, right? And so I think that, and you see it bubbling up, you know, you see this thing in Madagascar, you see all this thing in Senegal, you see this stuff going on. Yes, every now and then something bubbles up, like in Zambia or Uganda and Kenya, that it dies back down, and it bubbles up in Niger and it dies back down, and so on. There's no doubt that the pot is boiling. It is boiling. It's not bubbling yet, but there's no question. You have to be pretty blind. One of the hilarious things is when people do analyses of geopolitics, and it's all about China and the US. Global South, don't forget, as if there's absolutely nothing going on. People are asleep, or that maybe they dance in dance hall or Afrobeats or whatever it is. They have play no role in human history. Right? This is hilarious, right? When in fact, the pot is boiling. It is boiling, right? So I am more optimistic. Not in my lifetime. I don't think I'd live. I mean, why should I, to see anything like this? But that's of no consequence. But the point is that the depth of the issues and the capacity to address those issues, those two are two crucial ingredients, and you have it far more than we have it in the Caribbean. And there's so much impact which some island of 2.9 million people or even 5 million people can make compared to a place of 200 million people, right? Which is interconnected, you know. And also, don't forget the Sahel, you know. I mean, the chronic crisis in the Sahel, any shift in Nigeria, any change in Nigeria will have a dramatic impact on the Sahel. And that is serious stuff. That is very serious stuff, right? So that this is why I'm optimistic, because I do feel that if you look at more deeply and more carefully, and if you respect people more, respect the Black intellectual more, respect the Nigerian professional more, see things from their point of view. One of my hobby horses, I'm sorry to go on this, you know, they had told me, but a lot of the stuff written on Africa, West Africa, you know, I won't bother naming any names, is written to satisfy the West, or from that perspective. Okay, fine. I mean, it's their money, so they write from that. So fine, of course, no problem, right? So that, and so when I say this too, I include us in the Caribbean, is often events are presented to satisfy the priorities of the diaspora, for example. What the diaspora is interested in, what the diaspora is concerned about, you know? So the diaspora wants to have the slave trade presented a certain way, right? The diaspora, if they come to December and they go to thing and see Nigeria, it is Balagra, wherever it is, they're offended. Okay, I understand this. But Nigeria shouldn't fix its history because a diasporic visitor is offended, including me, must fix its history because Nigeria wants to fix its history for Nigerians, right? Not because it's hampered the tourist trade. It spoiled somebody's death in December. Who cares? Right? It must be for the people, from the point of view of the people themselves. And this is why, Andrew Ali gave me a copy of your book, the book with yourself. He sent it to me, very kind, when I was in New York. And this is why I value the book so much. And I hope that there's a, what do you call it, a prequel? Is a prequel, not the thing that come before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can see you sort of playing with it, I mean, silk science of your nibbling around at it and so on. It's a big job. It's a big job. I don't know how you do it. But I think that the deeper you go, I, for example, would like somebody to go back to 1591 at that Moroccan collapse of Shanghai, which is really historically pivotal, because that is what breaks the tie, the trans-Saharan tie, more than anything else, which sort of puts the Sahel into this sort of nowhere zone where the whole of that collapses because the Moroccans destroyed. And the Portuguese come around the back on the coast, right, and do an end run against the Moroccans, and the Moroccan thing fails. They failed to get the goal, which is what they wanted. That's why they travel all across the Sahara to come down all the way to Shanghai to get the goal. Right? They never get any goal, but they destroyed Shanghai. It never recovered. It never recovered. It was finished. Right? Laid waste to, right? Complete. And in a funny way, the crisis in the Sahel, and then of course the French come on top of that, and then that is disaster to the nth level with the French colonial experience, which was vicious and brutal, coming across from Senegal right across there, absolutely indescribable genocidal activities by the French coming across. Right? So I would love somebody to go back more. I think you have to go back more, right? Not necessarily you personally, but historians have to go back a bit further. Before the Lugard period, before the formation, the pre-formation, or whatever you call it, right? Because not because you want to carry out the history, because those historical forces come right through, coming right through, including the Lugard period, and coming right down now so you can't understand the depth of those forces unless you can really go back a little further. Besides, I've always had contempt for Lugard, and I've never understood why Nigerians keep talking about Lugard, who is, as far as I'm concerned, just a social climb on, hustler. So, umpteen people like him in colonial history is not all. Not only the British side, the Russian side, all over. Germans, there was tons of these people, adventurers of what sort, they were using the colonial thing to social climb in their own societies. That's what they really are all trying to do. So that's basically, I think we need to try and go back a little bit. And so both you guys doing such good work. I know it's sound. I'm trying to flatter you. Of course I'm trying to flatter you, but nonetheless, it's true. It's really true. And I do hope that it's, you need more support. I don't know. I mean, and if you can find some way of getting the professionals in Nigeria, not just to like you on Substack, and I mean, of course I should, right? And I should subscribe and so on. But they also need to find some way to carry forward your ideas in a practical way within the limits of their possibilities, within the limits of their possibilities. This to me will be the greatest tribute to the work that you're doing, right? Goes beyond liking you on Substack a lot, and even unsubscribing, because to see that your ideas, not necessarily exactly as how you put them forward, of course, not at all, but you can see that your ideas are actually taking root and something's actually sprouting, right? And this to me is something which is absolutely, it will happen, It is going to happen. I have no doubt it will happen. It probably is already happening. This is absolutely priceless. Absolutely priceless.
Professor Robotham, thank you very much. It's been an honor and it's a real privilege having you on today. I know you want me not to call you professor, but I mean, I'm still at the end of the day, I'm still a Yoruba man at heart. So
Yes,
your choice is either I call you professor or I call you sir, but I'm not going to call you your name. Sorry. It's just all right. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you on, and we'll continue to have our discussions, and I hope listeners would have enjoyed just listening to some of it's like almost inviting listeners into our WhatsApp conversations, and I hope they've enjoyed that. Thank you very much again, once again.
Oh, thank you. I hope people, I don't know, find it useful in some way, but I greatly enjoyed it and benefited. And that made me have to think about things.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.